Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to my Saturday Hodgepodge, my weekly wrap-up of BookTube, bookish things, bookish thoughts, books I've been reading. This week I wanted to start off by kind of jumping back into a discussion that started last week when Roz from Scally Dealing About the Books posted a video essentially about, can books and reading change who we are as people? This was in reaction to a British judge handing down a sentence to a young man who was convicted of possessing all kinds of right-wing, racist, misogynist reading material. He sentenced him to read classic works of literature, obviously with the thought that by reading classic works of literature, this young man might develop more empathy for people who are not like him, that those works might change him. Now, regardless of how you feel about that, and I think, most of us as readers believe that that reading changes us, that reading broadens our perspective, that reading, has incrementally changed us over time. I certainly feel that to be true, regardless of whether I think that is an effective punishment, whether you think because it's punishment it's not going to work. No matter what you think about it, it did bring up kind of some interesting questions about, what is the purpose of reading? What are books for? Steve Donahue made a great video talking about specifically this issue. A lot of things, surprise, surprise, I agree with about the existence of a law which tries to regulate your reading and some other things. And Mark Nash made a video about, I think essentially what is fiction or what is fiction for. I'll leave a link to all three of their videos down below, but primarily it's Mark's video that I wanted to respond to. And this is actually a conversation I believe that Mark and I have begun and had once before. And this has to do with, from my point of view, the reality of fiction. In his video, Mark points out that fiction isn't reality, that when you read a novel, you are reading a human construct. It's not something that occurs in nature, that there's a form which you can either choose to follow or you can choose to break away from, and that what you're reading is a representation of reality and not reality itself. Mark, as an author, says one of the things he hopes to provoke in his readers is an emotional response, but that he's not sure how much reading actually changes us, and how big an impact reading has on us as readers. And that all novels are really in conversation with one another and not really attempting to display the real world or to capture or to tell us anything necessarily about the real world beyond emotional responses and perhaps a very small piece of information. I want to disagree with Mark here just a little bit, which is always dangerous because well, Mark's a really smart fellow, but I want to disagree with him here just for a second. About a couple of things that I want to talk about, one of which involves what I will admit is a theory I have, which may or may not be original, but which, even in me thinking about it, strikes me as being somewhat weird. So the first thing I have a problem with is the idea that, the novel is an unnatural construct, that it's man-made. Number one, we are a part of nature. The things that we make are a part of the natural world. And I realize this is not exactly what Mark meant, but when I think we apply that to the novel, what we're really applying that to or talking about is storytelling. And human beings appear, from what we know of history, to have been storytellers from the very beginning. And I don't think it's a coincidence, and I suspect that our oldest recorded stories kind of follow a narrative arc that we're familiar with as readers of short stories and novels. And so, to me, that kind of indicates that there is something innately human about storytelling, that there is something about this form, about what we expect, and we may defy the expectations of that for various effects on our readers, etc. But there's something about that that is in fact natural. If you look at cultures that didn't have written languages, like the First Nations people of the United States, if you look at those groups of people, they told stories without ever writing them down, without ever, creating a narrative structure like the novel, and yet, their stories have kind of clear beginnings and endings. They have action, they have characters, they have, admirable characters and characters who are not admirable. They tell stories, they teach lessons, they create empathy, they create solidarity, These were stories that were told by real people in the real world to as Mark points out, to create a reality for that group of people. But I don't think that because it's man-made, it's less real, it's less natural. And to me, and I'm not an expert on the history of the novel, but to me the novel is just an evolution of that kind of thing, an evolution of that kind of storytelling. There's a reason why we can go back and read the works of the ancient Greeks and so on and still get something out of it, because there is this just kind of innately human thing about storytelling and listening to stories. So I don't think that because something's man-made means it's not a part of the real or the natural world, or because it's not necessarily naturally occurring, because I see us as a part of nature, the things we create being as natural as the things that birds create or that ants create or whatever it is. But anyway, aside from that, the other thing I wanted to talk about, and this is where the weird theory, which may or may not be original. If it's not, please tell me where I got this from, because you'll really be helping me. But the idea to me that fiction isn't real because it describes fictional characters and the author is literally making these things up. To me, that doesn't preclude them from being real. So to get into in me thinking about how I read and how I process reading, I've come to the conclusion, I'm not sure this is always true, but I've come to the conclusion that I'm most satisfied as a reader when I feel like I am in some kind of mental communion with the author. That it's the author who I am learning about. The author as that person, the author is an example of a type of human being, an author is an example of someone who is smarter than me, an author's example of somebody who is the same as me, an author's example of someone who I can relate to. But that is a conversation, in a sense, between me and the author, that the story tells as much about the storyteller as it does about itself. And so when an author writes a story, they are literally recording their thoughts on paper, or electronically now. They're literally recording their thoughts on paper. And when I read what they've written, those thoughts are transmitted from the author to me. Okay, now we can think about that as kind of something that's just, almost metaphysical, that, almost on a spiritual level. But the truth of the matter is that thinking and our thoughts happen within the real and physical world. When we think about anything, there is an electrochemical process which takes place in our brains, and energy is consumed by that. Okay? Our thinking consumes energy. Our thinking our thoughts are represented in the real physical world by these electronic charges and signals that are sent back and forth. That energy comes from the food we eat and all kinds of things like that, but literally, our thoughts exist in the physical world. They don't exist in the non-physical world. They exist in the physical world. And therefore our thoughts are as real as anything else. And whether I am a painter or a writer or a poet or a photographer or an architect, I am transmitting my thoughts about whatever it is. About humanity, about empathy, about beauty, about pain, about evil, about good. I am capturing those thoughts, those physical thoughts, and on paper, electronically, with ink, however it is, and they are preserved then in the physical world. A book is a physical object. It exists in the real world. It in and of itself is real. The ink on the page is real. The words on the page are a transcription of those thought processes which took place inside my head. They are as real as anything else in the world. They exist in reality. And when a reader picks up the book and reads those words, that thought is then taken from the page and it becomes a physical thought in the brain, in the mind of the reader, which again is represented and carried and understood through these electrochemical processes. That process is a part of reality. And so on that level, the things we think in books, the thoughts we get from books are as real, whether the book is fictional or non-fictional. Those thoughts are as real as anything else. Now, I'm not suggesting, that a character that I read in a book is a real person who exists in the physical world, but the thoughts that the author captured about, thought about that character, and preserved about that character on paper become real thoughts in my head. Just as if I were to see a person across the street in the real physical world and make a judgment about them based on their appearance, which unfortunately oftentimes we all do, there's no real difference in that in terms of what takes place in my brain. I will admit that the actual mechanics of that are different. But there's no real difference to me in terms of thoughts than if I read that description of that person in a book. Those two things are equally real. So if they are then equally real, there's no reason for us not to expect that having read about a character, having read an author's thought, an author's creation of a character, and that character, part of what the author wants us to do is to empathize with that character, there's no real reason to see that as not being real. That emotional response is real, that character is, in terms of our thoughts, is as real as the things we make up about the people we see in the physical world. That is, in a sense, also reality. A physical reality represented by the electronics in our brains and the thinking that goes on. And kind of like, to use a Star Trek reference, kind of like a Vulcan mind meld, it gives me the opportunity to feel what the author was feeling and to think what the author was thinking. Now you might be thinking, well, what if the author is just manipulating you? Fine, the author still had to think the thoughts that led them to believe that this would manipulate this emotion in me. I am still in communion with that other person, and better than a Vulcan mind meld, I don't actually have to be there physically alive with them, touching them. That energy, that thought can be transmitted over time. That the books that we preserve and the things that we read, Jane Austen for existence, mean that Jane Austen's thoughts are physically still present. That her thoughts go on. As long as people read her books, her thoughts go on. Is that a perfect interpretation of exactly what she thought? No, because of, communication breakdown with words and languages and other things like that, and us maybe not knowing exactly what her intent was. But they still exist, and they will continue to exist in the actual physical world, both as they are preserved on the page in a book, and when we read those thoughts as they cause a electrochemical reaction in our brain, which is a very real thing. And so, in the end, I think that yes, books do change us. Will books change the young man in question, the case that Roz brought up, enough to make him reform? I doubt it, because I think change like that is more incremental, and the more it's forced on you, the more likely you are to reject it. But anyway, there's some kind of rambling, weird thoughts for you about books and how they work, and why the reality that we read in a work of fiction is in some ways as real as reality. So moving away from that then, and kind of talking about my week in reading, I did finish 3 books. 3 books? I finished 3 books? Yes, I finished 3 books this week. So the first book I finished was Quiet Flows the Una by Faruk Sehic, translated by Will Firth. This is it was translated from Bosnian by Will Firth. This is a novel essentially by a Bosnian poet and author, which in some ways touches on his experiences during the Bosnian War, but also is then also kind of a meditation on his connection to the community he grew up in along the banks of the Una River, with the Una figuring in all kinds of different ways, symbolically and in reality, in his thoughts and in his ideas about community and identity. And I really thought it was very, very good. There's some things in here which I just thought were kind of extraordinary. So here we go. Here's an example of the author's writing, and just to give you some idea of what it's like. And one reason, I think I mentioned to you earlier that I was having to take a long time with this book, and this is kind of why. Whenever fear took hold, that utter fear that seizes even the nitrogen molecules in the air, he would appear and free me of the fear of death, and then I would be as light as a hummingbird and fast as a virus. That's why I decided to look for him in the return address on the letter I received after the war, signed with his name. I found the apartment in 5 Emily Dickinson Street on the 3rd floor of a gray building that looked like a sick pigeon, as Ferdinand Leger would have imagined it. It was a flat worthy of the prophet of non-existent religion, which he was in his own right, though no one had yet raised kitsch statues to him like the ones in Catholic churches that made me feel nauseous as a small boy, in fear of death that the cold interior smelled of. The relics of his bones weren't encased in gold and silver like reliquaries. Whenever I see a pedant with the hair of a saint or some other reliquary, I realize with sadness how little of God is left on earth, how primitive people are if they believe that a forearm with a hand cast in gold with unnaturally slender fingers and golden nails can possess the supernatural power to do anything other than stand around in a glass case with less kinetic energy than the cheapest jelly vibrator made in China. So I just thought just an incredible kind of just thought processes and incredibly dense imagery and ideas and symbolism and irreverence. I really just enjoyed the book a lot, but it was a read I had to slow down and pay a lot of attention to. I also finished Soldier's Pay by William Faulkner. This is Faulkner's first novel, and I went into it thinking, as the name kind of implies, and the time it was written, that it would be a novel about World War I. It really is a novel about the aftermath of World War I, written by a man who had no experience in World War I. Which, you know, in some levels of honesty, he actually kind of portrays in some of his characters who were on the brink of going into combat in World War I, and then the war came to an end. I found this book to be a really interesting read, and yet, going back to my reading dead racist authors video, and yet the book is filled with racist language and racist imagery. It is incredibly, I think, misogynist in its portrayal of women, as kind of teasing men and taunting men and never giving men that deserve their love, and etc. And it's just, in that way, it was, you know, unpleasant. But, you know, it's interesting to me as kind of a Faulkner completist and someone who reads a lot of Faulkner to see that even in kind of this really, I think, flawed first novel, you can kind of see Faulkner's willingness to be kind of edgy, to push the limits of what probably censors would allow and wouldn't allow, and his obsession with certain images that are repeated over and over again, particularly with rain. There's a lot of rain in the novel, but just kind of an interesting read. It would not be necessarily a book I would recommend to somebody who wants to read Faulkner, but an interesting book for me. I've also been buddy reading How to Pronounce Knife by Souvankham Thammavongsa, a Laotian Canadian writer, and this is a book of short stories, and buddy reading that with Courtney Fairder. I always enjoy getting to talk to Courtney about anything, because I always like talking to people who are a lot smarter than me about anything, and that's been an enjoyable buddy read experience. I'll save my thoughts about the story for later because I haven't had a chance to check in with Courtney yet. But we'll be doing our check-in today. So those are the three books I've been reading. I also started reading William Trevor's Love in Summer, kind of inspired by Bob the Bookerer's video about people who were nominated multiple times for the Booker Prize, William Trevor being one of those. I realized I have a lot of William Trevor novels on my shelves that I haven't read, and so I thought I would try to start reading those, since kind of free-forming things here in September. And then I'm also decided to read for Latinx Latinx Heritage Month. I also decided to read When I Was Puerto Rican by Esmeralda Santiago. This is a memoir which I first heard about on Alba's channel, Seriela. I'll leave a link to her channel down below, but I'm just starting on that as well. So that's kind of what I am reading right now, as well as one other reading project. So I've been kind of rambling on. I'm going to go ahead and stop myself, but I do want to give some musical recommendations with links down below of some songs I've been listening to. For some reason, I heard a song on the radio, and I thought, wow, I wonder, for whatever reason, I became kind of obsessed for a short period of time of listening to songs about the ocean, or about the sea, or big bodies of water. So that's what I have here. These are songs about the ocean. And the first song about the ocean I want to mention is The Ocean by Led Zeppelin, which is my favorite Led Zeppelin song and one of the great rock and roll songs of all time. I'll leave a link down below. Also, not exactly the ocean, but The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by, is that Gordon Lightfoot? Hang on. Yes, the record, the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot. I make sure to look that up so I wasn't wrong about that. I think the song I was listening to in the radio that got me thinking about songs about the ocean was Walk on the Ocean by Toad the Wet Sprocket. Link to that down below as well. And then that kind of kicks off getting into the 90s songs about the ocean. Santa Monica by Everclear, which has some great lines, I think, about missing someone in there. And so that song's in here. The lyric or the chorus has the ocean in it. And then the last song is Behind the Sun by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which is about swimming in the ocean and mystical dolphins and all kinds of weird stuff. Anyway, there you go. There are my songs about the ocean. There's my Saturday Hodgepodge. Look forward to your comments about my weird thinking and thoughts and whether or not they make sense in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching.